It's a pleasure to be in Lincoln. I am by birth half a Cornhusker. And you might ask, what is half a Cornhusker? My father was born in Minden, home of Harold Warp's Pioneer Village, and I was surprised today when I checked into the hotel. On my floor on the wall, there was a print, kind of strange circular print, of Harold Warp's Pioneer Village from Minden, Nebraska. So this is birthplace of my dad, Neil, who went to the University of Nebraska, studied engineering here, and also my uncle studied architecture here in the 50s, although he did not graduate. He moved on to USC, but we can overlook that part. Today I'm going to present some architectural stories I've crafted, or more accurately pirated, as a way of thinking about our culture, architectural and otherwise. To frame these stories, I'd like to read a brief piece I assembled for the 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennial Catalog. It's an almost direct copy from Joshua Reynolds' opening lecture given upon assuming the presidency of the Royal Academy in London in 1774, and speaks in 4 parts to the methodology employed of most of what will follow in my talk. We come now to speak of imitation, of borrowing a particular thought, action, attitude, or figure, and translating it into your own work. It is generally allowed that no architect need be ashamed of copying. An architect who borrows an idea and so accommodates it to their own work that it makes a part of it with no seam or joining appearing can hardly be charged with plagiarism. Poets practice this kind of borrowing without reserve, but an architect should not be contented with this only. They should enter into a competition with the original and endeavor to improve what they are appropriating to their own work. Such imitation is a perpetual exercise of the mind, a continual invention. To find excellencies, however dispersed, to discover beauties, however concealed by the multitude of deficits with which they are surrounded, can be only the work of one who has extended their view, selecting both from what is great and what is little, making the universe tributary towards furnishing their mind and enriching their works with originality and a variety of inventions. It is indisputably evident that a great part of every architect's life must be employed in collecting materials for the exercise of genius. Invention, strictly speaking, is little more than a new combination of those images that have previously gathered and deposited in the memory. Nothing can come from nothing. An architect who has laid up no materials can produce no combinations. So with that setup covered, I want to shift to the primary focus of my talk today, my Atlas of Another America that Jason mentioned earlier. It's a collection of stories about the American dream produced through the combination of materials, words, images, architectures that I've laid up in Reynolds' terms over the years. Atlas of Another America is a work of satirical cultural analysis delivered in the form of a fictional architectural treatise for the utopia of Freedomland. It put forward a critique of American culture, reflecting upon the choices we've made and the choices we might have made, and of architecture culture. The book is modeled on historical architectural treatises and pattern books, which are a popular means of disseminating and promoting architectural ideas and significantly architectural practices in the 17th and 18th centuries. These books flourished in England with the rise of Enlightenment thinking and continue to be popular mostly in the United States, alongside the expansion of industrial capitalism in the 19th century. The origins of these pattern books are, of course, in Palladio's Quattro Libri of 1570, which was widely reprinted and distributed throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, most frequently in England. On the left, we have the frontispiece of Palladio's publication, and on the right, Colin Campbell's English version of 1728, reworked to include a bust of Palladio above the title. You can see that on the right-hand slide. As can be seen in these 2 engravings, the frontispieces in an architectural treatise, or in their later progeny, architectural pattern books, was a drawing that was used to set the tone of the work, connecting it to the great models of history and to the tools of the architectural trade, as we see in Palladio's or in Campbell's reworking of Palladio, to honor and connect to the legacy of great architects. So you can see in here there's the tools, calipers, dividers. It's basically giving you a kind of world in which the work that you're going to see in the treatise or the pattern book will inhabit. The frontispiece was also deployed to set the scene for the work that would follow. As we see here in William Wright's amazing and slightly perverse Grotesque Architecture or Rural Amusement of 1790, a book of designs for outbuildings and follies with which an English gentleman could adorn his estate. This, if you go on archive.org, you can look this volume up. It's really worth the trouble. So in Atlas of Another America, I used a frontispiece to claim a place for Freedomland in the idealized, even mythological conception of North America as an untamed nature awaiting a new civilization and soon to be subjected to the great American conceit of manifest destiny. Freedomland is a kind of counterfactual history, or, if read forward, a cautionary future for American development. In presenting the project and telling the story about the American dream, images, as you'll see, are used strategically to produce this ambiguous temporal reading. So here we have, in the book I used historic landscape paintings and collaged in elements of Freedomland. But here, in fact, I collaged in the book itself. So in your hands, you're holding Atlas of Another America, and these birds are examining the plans for Freedomland as this kind of first, say, colonization of the continent. But before I present you with the splendor that is Freedomland, I'd like to begin with the appendix to better situate the ideas and methods guiding the work, to reveal, if you will, the materials from which Freedomland was built. If you'll forgive me, I'd like to read a piece from Six Typical Plans, read from a piece called Six Typical Plans, an analysis of the houses, specifically the plans of American commercial home builders. These are the primary building blocks of Freedomland. The suburban single-family house, more than any other object, is the primary symbol of success in America. It is the preeminent representation of its owner's aspirations. It functions to construct individual identity and register personal achievement. To own a home is to live the dream. American home builders have long capitalized on this equation, which binds the house as an object to the dream as a concept. These products, the primary building blocks of the contemporary suburban metropolis, are carefully calibrated weapons of commerce that connect with and simultaneously create the domestic expectations of consumers. While it might seem difficult to categorize these products as architecture, to dismiss them out of hand at a time when much architectural research is dedicated to redressing the ills of the suburban environment is to disconnect architecture from a live current of contemporary culture. So rather than reject these models wholesale, it seems necessary to identify and utilize the actionable intelligence embedded in them. This requires that we see these houses as architecture and assess them as such. Six Typical Plans is the result of just such an assessment. It's an investigation into the organizational logics that lie behind the speculative house's seemingly normative facade. The result of a comparative analysis of nearly 1,000 plans, it identifies a series of architectural strategies that govern the design of the models deployed by American builders. The individual plan, as used in the marketing material of a home builder, maps out an idea of domesticity, of a possible lifestyle for the prospective homebuyer. Many plans, when analyzed critically, offer evidence of an underlying set of 6 distinct plan types that form the core of the home builder's arsenal and allow them to deliver different levels of design to a diverse array of homebuyers. 2 of these types, and so here you see a sort of a tree of these 6 plan types, beginning with the Foursquare on your left. 2 of these types, Foursquare and laminar, are essentially variations on long-used production house types. The other 4 types, what I call cellular, bisected, nuclear, and branching, all betray some relationship to the simpler Foursquare and laminar organizational techniques and offer evidence of the builder's carefully considered reorganization of and amplifications of familiar domestic arrangements. These primary organizational arrangements are complemented by the knowing and considered use of an array of design techniques, including the thickening of surfaces, the exploitation of diagonal lines of sight and movement, the scenographic layering of spaces, and the deployment of distinct room shapes and profiles. Thus, while only 6 basic types define the canon of the contemporary American production house, an innumerable number of variations or models allow that house to be marketed as a customized product, providing a sense of distinct luxury to each buyer, regardless of income level. And so here I'll just go through. So in the book, there's the tree of types, and then each type is looked at through specific existing examples, through 5 cases. So here's the Foursquare, and you can see these are all at the same scale. So you also get a sense of just the range of sizes of homes. This is the laminar, cellular. Cellular is the least organized, one could say. Essentially, I call it cellular because it's just like cancerous cell growth, right? Room piled upon room. The nuclear, which is perhaps the most formal, along with the bisected, which essentially follows, and you can really see it here. I don't think I can point, but in the left-hand page, the bottom right, a kind of Palladian home. and then the branching plan. These houses, these typical plans are everywhere in some form or another. There are nuclear versions in the deserts of the Southwest, bisected versions roaming the edges of cities from New York to Atlanta to Minneapolis, branching plans reproducing and running wild across the prairies of Texas and the forest of the Southeast. Ignoring them won't make them go away, and ignoring the desires they engender and serve won't make them go away either. In Atlas of Another America, I decided to take these houses seriously, if sometimes comically, and to make demands on them. What other stories could these houses tell? What are their limits? Jason, do you think you could get like a Kleenex or something? But in working on these houses, or should I say with these houses, I felt that it was necessary not just to understand the houses as we see them today, but to understand how we got here. Where does the Bellwind come from? This is the Bellwind by Toll Brothers, who are really my second most favorite home builders, after David Weekley, who's a Texas builder. In order to answer that question, I looked back to the treatises and pattern books of the past, back to Palladio, father or better patron saint of the suburban ideal that still haunts American residential logics and development patterns. Palladio's 4 books provided the model for many domestic pattern books in England in the 18th century, like this one by William Halfpenny from 1749. And his designs provided the model for the houses that populated the pages of these books. And increasingly with the rise of Enlightenment conceptions of self, the private dwelling became, in John Archer's terms, a medium through which to construct identity and anchor oneself in space. Henry Wotton, writing in 1624 in The Elements of Architecture, describes the house as follows. Every man's proper mansion, house, and home is the theater of his hospitality, the seat of his self-fruition, the comfortablest part of his own life, the noblest of his son's inheritance, a kind of private princedom, nay, to the possessors thereof, an epitome of the whole world. In England, the pattern book sought to distribute the promise of the rural house to all classes of people, the farmer and the peasant as well as the gentleman. And where formerly the house stood alone on the white page of the book, like Palladio's villas, increasingly it came to be rendered in an idealized rural or natural landscape, in its own little Eden, or rural agrarian paradise. And we see very early in these pattern books houses, the claim for luxury and grandeur and uniqueness that is still present in the suburban house of today. This is the plan and elevation for a small house in the style of a chateau. And here we have a villa in the style of an abbey by Richard Elsom. Elsom writes in his essay on rural architecture of 1803 that, quote, "In the country the gentleman is at full liberty to do just as he pleases, and the architect has a full scope to display his genius and talents. No wonder, then, to find gentlemen whose employments and business lies in the city are so desirous of a villa or a country seat a few miles out of town." And across the English Channel at about the same time, Jane L. Duran writes that, quote, "If happiness is anywhere to be found, it is surely in a country house, agreeably sited, far from the cares of business, the tumult of cities, and the vices of overpopulous communities. In such peaceable dwellings, the sweetest repose may be enjoyed, and the joys of study savored without distraction there. The delights of friendship are unconstrained, the soul is exalted by the magnificent spectacle of nature." And in 1804, Edmund Bartell, architect of this rustic abode, wrote, "The love of a country life seems to be innate in the human breast. Man seeks the large and populous city from necessity." Thank you. Across the 19th century, these pattern books for rural houses proliferated in England. This is a plate from W.F. Pocock's Architectural Designs for Rustic Cottages. And here is a design by Robert Luger from his architectural sketches for cottages, rural dwellings, and villas. While the designs took a variety of styles, the drawings all isolate the house in nature. Sometimes to an absurd degree, as in design number 1 from P.F. Robinson's Rural Architecture of 1828. So this, I think, is kind of amazing. This is an English pattern book. That doesn't look like the England that I know. It looks more like an Alpine house. So we also have the deceit is here from the beginning also. The pattern book was also popular in the US in the 19th century, as was the ideal of the country house and its concomitant benefits. A.J. Downing, writing in 1847, states, "In this country, we believe in the bettering influences of beautiful country houses, in the improvement of human nature necessarily resulting to all classes from the possession of lovely gardens and fruitful orchards." Early on, the house standing alone in a bucolic landscape became associated with the American dream. And that same image, that same ideal, retains its power today. Another Toll Brothers house. But there are other histories and stories of how we might live that we should consider. Some well known, like Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities of Tomorrow of 1902, in which Howard wrote, "Human society and the beauty of nature are meant to be enjoyed together. The two magnets must be made one. The town is a symbol of society. The country is the source of all health, wealth, and knowledge. Its fullness of joy and wisdom has not revealed itself to man, nor can it ever so long as this unholy, unnatural separation of society and nature endures. Town and country must be married, and out of this joyous union will spring a new hope, a new life, a new civilization." Importantly, in an early treatise published before Palladio, another model of the house as an aggregate of dwellings was put forward. In 1559, Jacques-André de Cerceau published the first volume of his Livre d'Architecture, which, much in the manner of the later pattern books of the 18th century, provided designs for dwellings for people of all classes. While each is essentially presented as a single house or chateau, the designs themselves are composed of independent pavilions held together by strong geometry and linked by courts, arcades, and broad passages. You see another one? This is an incredible book. It's almost like if John Hyde traveled back in time and worked in the 16th century. The house, composed of pavilions ordered geometrically and bound together by arcades, courts, and passages, here under the guidance, it seems, of Palladio, but I believe also de Cerceau, is also a technique used by Ledoux, as we see here in A House for Father and Three Children. But here in the Cheneby, likely designed in the 1780s, it takes a true collectivist ambition. Ledoux describes it as follows: 16 families lived together in the calm of the woods. They each had a complete apartment, all the needs of an isolated life, vegetable gardens, others for useful and medicinal plants, orchards, meadows, cultivated fields, others reserved for pastures, vineyards, wine presses, services, the communal salon, the dining room. All the accessories that ensure comfort and convenience were brought together. The heads of the family, governed by trust, good example, and feelings of piety, propagated the lessons of wisdom more than any school of morality. Religion attached them to the laws of the country. They found in its consoling exercise a sweet and tranquil life. The hope for good and a fear of evil. Their religion was that which reason has bestowed on our own Enlightenment thinkers. They expressed their gratitude to the Creator and lived to accomplish the duties imposed by the divinity. Surrounded by all the virtues, they had no idea of evil. And closer to home in the United States, there were, throughout the 19th century and into the first years of the 20th, ideas and proposals, and in some cases actual experiments in finding alternatives to the suburban ideal. A very important influence on much of these American experiments was Charles Fourier of France. In 1843, Albert Brisbane, one of his American disciples, wrote about Fourier's ideas as follows: "The laws of association, discovered by Fourier, is the social destiny of man. It is a true and natural system of society and will, when established upon earth, secure to him that happiness for which he has so long sought in vain. An association is an assemblage of persons united voluntarily for the purpose of directing their efforts, energies, and talents in the best way for the happiness and elevation of the whole." Jean-Baptiste Gaudin, a French industrialist who put Fourier's ideas into practice in his social palace at Guise in France, stated, "In association, the building of the home ceases to be at the mercy of the ignorance and lack of means of the individual. For that which isolated resources cannot accomplish become possible when those resources are combined. Constructed with a view to unity of purpose and interest, the homes, like the people, approach each other, stand solidly together, and form a vast pile in which all the resources of the builder's arts contribute to best answer the needs of families and individuals." I love this notion of the buildings actually sort of ambling up to each other and collecting. In looking a little more carefully at the domestic pattern books that I showed earlier, one sees that the idea of several houses, quote, "standing solidly together," has been studied by several of the architects of the rural and suburban ideal. So you see here 2-family houses and 3-family houses. Here's James Peacock's design for a pinwheeling 4-family home. Joseph Gandy, John Soane's great renderer and delineator, cluster of workers' cottages of 1805. And designs by P.F. Robinson, that was the renderer of the Alpine House, for collective dwellings both grand and modest, if that can be called modest. And here's Robert Owen describing his experimental community at New Harmony in 1841. This, then, is what may fairly be termed a magnificent palace, containing within itself the advantages of a metropolis, a university, and a country residence, without any of their disadvantages, and situated within a beautiful park, placing within reach of its inhabitants arrangements far superior to any now known nor yet possessed by the most favored individuals in any age or country. There are many American proposals for model cities and societies, and many books published describing them in detail. Henry Ulrich from Omaha, Nebraska in 1915, and the Midwest is full of these, published his book, Modern Paradise, an outline or story of how some of the cultured people will probably live, work, and organize in the near future. That's the full title. In it he writes, echoing Owen and Fourier before him, that, quote, no palace of any king was ever so grand, so healthful, so convenient, and so elevating to the life and character of its occupants as the cooperative mansion. Now this is the cooperative mansion, so I don't know that it lives up to the textual description, but the ambition is clearly there. But of course, this is mostly what we know now of these experiments. So I think it's worth reading this. The Fourier system of communal living was attempted here between 1843 and 1848. Approximately 30 families lived by rules established in councils of industry, commerce, justice, and education. Their new social order was a failure. Still, I don't think these ambitions for some type of more conscious understanding of our interdependence as citizens is something we should consign to the dustbin of history. And so we come once again to the birds of Freedomland. And if you'll forgive me, I'll now slip into character as Keith Krumwiede, author of an immodest proposal for the redesign of America called Freedomland, in which the object in view is to unite in a better manner than has hitherto been done, and with a taste founded in our very nature with economy and utility, American homes so as to combine architectural fitness with picturesque effect in the service of building communities connected to our noble past and prepared for an uncertain future. In 1717, Robert Montgomery, in his discourse concerning the designed establishment of a new colony to the south of Carolina in the most delightful country of the universe, wrote, quote, neither would we have thought it a labor so tedious as 'tis generally fancied, to establish in this manner a colony, which may become not only an advantage, but a glory to the nation. We have prospects before us most attractive and unprecedented, in the three tempting points, wealth, safety, and liberty. Benefits like these can never fail of drawing numbers of inhabitants from every corner, and men once got together, so this is a real quote. Most of what I'm reading I've invented, but this is a real quote. And men once got together, 'tis as easy to dispose them regularly and with due regard to order, beauty, and the comforts of society, as to leave them to the folly of fixing at random and destroying their interest by indulging their humor, so that we have more than ordinary cause to expect that in a very short time we shall be able to present the solid life itself, as now we give the shadow only in the following exploration. So just a brief aside, Robert Montgomery never came to North America. He was given a grant by the king to this area in what is now Georgia, and he wrote this discourse and had this drawn up, or drew it up, I'm not sure which, for this new colony. And this really formed a kind of foundation for me for Freedomland, both the kind of hubris of it, right? Not having seen it, that we can do these things. And it's maybe worth pointing out, because I wanted Freedomland to exist as something that sort of vibrated between like an earnest proposal and a kind of critical analysis, right? It's both utopian, aspirationally utopian, but also critical of the kind of discipline that utopias have often required, right? This notion of, 'tis easy to dispose them regularly. So in the spirit of Robert Montgomery, and having been required by the times to draw up, so now I'm back in character as this megalomaniacal architect, which maybe I am. So in that spirit, and having been required by the times to draw up a detailed plan for the general improvement of American housing in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, and its effect upon our collective confidence in the correctness of our living patterns, I humbly submit the following proposal for Freedomland. Don't worry, Freedomland is just the green stuff, so we're in Freedomland, sorry. We begin our description, as did Montgomery, in describing Azealia. You must suppose a level, dry, and fruitful tract of land in some fine plain or valley, that having been surveyed as part of the great parceling of America, according to the method set forth in the Land Ordinance of 1785, is continuously gridded into square townships of 6 miles per side, each containing 36 one-mile square sections of 640 acres. This is a little tedious, but I think it's worth it. Let me know if it's not. This grid, the framework for Thomas Jefferson's vision of a rural democratic society of citizen farmers, but also a great game board of rampant real estate speculation, provides the underlying structure of Freedomland, a new settlement model that reconciles resurgent dreams for an agrarian urbanism with long habituated domestic appetites. It now being fully established by learned persons and increasingly acknowledged by lay persons that our current settlement patterns are both unlovely and unsustainable. Freedomland is premised then on the following irrefutable truths: that local farming is good, being that it provides better food and makes better use of our increasingly limited resources than commercial agriculture; that urban living is also good, improving as it does the health, happiness, and prosperity of the populace; and that the majority of Americans, the veracity of the above notwithstanding, still aspire to the material and spatial luxuries represented by the detached single-family house, as it is most resplendently found in the suburbs. The plan of Freedomland results from the subdivision of a typical survey township into 4 equal squares, 3 miles to each side. The northwest and southeast quadrants are established as new towns and further subdivided to form 36 square sections of 160 acres each, and are numbered accordingly. The 2 remaining quadrants are preserved in, or if necessary, restored to, their natural state as unencumbered retreats for the pleasures of the townspeople. 1 survey township thus divided is the absolute minimum area necessary for the establishment of Freedomland. If this plan is aggregated to form a group larger than a single 36 square mile township, then a checkerboard layout results in a like manner to that proposed by Mr. Jefferson, producing at the grand scale an alternating arrangement of town and country. There is no maximum limit to such an aggregation except for any geographical or political obstacles that may arise to thwart the just and proper extension of the township by the people. The 4 sections at the center of each town are occupied by a civic core comprised of the infrastructures necessary to the maintenance and preservation of the community. Whereas the original land ordinance reserves section 16 at the center of every survey township for the use of education, in Freedomland, being recognized that the choices in means and methods of education are best left to individual families, the central squares are rightly devoted to more pressing and universal needs. The waste square is an ever-growing manicured pyramid of refuse. You can see it here in this sort of manipulation of, oh, I can't read it, it's too small here, and why am I not remembering? Oh, Caspar David Friedrich's painting. The water square, a circular reservoir nearly 1/2 mile wide, occupies section 15. The energy square, a forest of 20 by 20 solar panels, powers the town from section 21. And the market square, anchored in section 22 by a 10-acre big box of community and commerce, provides a venue for public assembly as well as access to those products and services not produced through the prodigious industry of the townspeople. The waste square is an ever-growing, I just told you that. The 32 remaining sections are quartered to form 4 equal parcels of 40 acres each. The 128 individual neighborhood farm estates thus established, each an independent self-governing community, are further divided into 4 10-acre squares, of which 3 are dedicated to agricultural pursuits, while the dwellings are located on the 4th. In this manner, fully 3/4 of every town in Freedomland shall remain open, green, and free of buildings. Each neighborhood estate in Freedomland is comprised between 8 and 64 houses, with all those within any particular state being one just like the next, and in this manner ensuring a cohesiveness of identity and a consistency of character such that property values are protected and community values are promoted. Whereas architects have proven themselves disinclined or perhaps ill-prepared to deliver designs desired by the majority of the American people, the houses in Freedomland are built according to the designs carefully selected from among those best produced by the country's greatest builders. Designs that have proven to be popular with persons possessed of the most discerning taste and therefore certain to attract the finest type of citizen. Depending upon the number of houses and the particular manner in which they are arranged, a neighborhood of houses may take the character of either a large villa or a small village. Families are thus able to select the estate that most closely matches their spatial, stylistic, and consequently social preferences, thereby affording them a life among like-minded neighbors with a shared sense of duty and purpose. It being well known that people by their very nature are equally desirous of the pleasures of novelty as they are needful of the comforts of familiarity, Freedomland seeks to offer both in due time, taking advantage of the increasingly short lifespan of our houses, and in a manner similar to crop rotation. The entire estate, including the dwellings, which are dismantled and rebuilt, rotates counterclockwise every 20 years, completing a full rotation after 80 years. So essentially in one lifespan, you would have lived in every quadrant of your estate. And every 20 years, your view would change. This has the positive effect of providing each resident at regular intervals with a new home that is exactly the same as their old home. As each estate rotates, this has the further beneficial consequences of producing ever-changing prospect of built and open space throughout the town. So here you're seeing the 20-year intervals. It's hoped that this description, concise though it may be, or long as it may be, is sufficient to describe the sublime structure of Freedomland, its natural and rightful connection to the foundational principles of this great country, and its superiority to our current modes of settlement. So I'll now take you on just a very quick tour of some of the estates of Freedomland, pausing probably not at all to describe anything, but you'll see the plan. So every estate is drawn, so there are 128 estates, each is drawn to the same level of detail, and then inserted are the historic paintings with the new villages collaged in. And it paints a kind of portrait of, it's worth thinking about the images as sort of constructing a kind of social order that then begins to break down. But it opens with this, a kind of lone wanderer arriving in Freedomland. And there are both famous paintings and less well-known paintings used. So this is sort of the healthy view of Freedomland. And then weird things begin to happen. Cults emerge. No offense to any Catholics with that painting. It just worked. And the book also makes references to significant proposals in architectural history. So there are Corbusian references, there are Koolhaasian references. This is Exodus Landing. And some key quotes from Jefferson and Frank Lloyd Wright, Ledoux, Owen. Classes don't disappear in Freedomland, sadly. And privilege remains as well. I mean, part of the story is, in fact, that architecture, in some ways, cannot save us. And labor struggles emerge in Freedomland. So this is Don Bartolomeo Meets the Workers, something like that. Don Bartolomeo is one of my favorite writers and really the sort of the patron saint of most of this work. I would recommend looking into his short fiction and graphic fiction. You get the point. This stuff goes on and on and on. The Queen of Freedomland in the little village. So this is Marie Antoinette, essentially. Although it's not actually a painting of Marie Antoinette, I couldn't find a good one. And then the seeds of revolution are born. And still the architects sit in their area looking out upon their creation, feeling very, very chuffed, in a term that Jason would use, with themselves. So the book closes with a very short piece called New Homes for America, which I think Jason in his review said he wished was the main piece of the book. It's a very minor piece of the book. But it's worth, and I apologize, but I'm going to read again, and I'm going to read one other thing after this, so bear with me, but this is quite short. So it's called New Homes for America. a kind of trailer for what might come next from this project of pirating and sort of blending these developer plans together. Working feverishly through the night on her new assignment, the architect shuffled through the company's catalog of home plans, searching for the perfect profiles, the right balance of expression and order, internal embellishment and external massing. Huddled over the machine, she made copy after copy, mirroring the plans as she went, clipping away a bit here or a chunk there, and then matching it to its inverted neighbor. She was on a deadline. Her employer wanted something new, something bigger and better, for all those empty nesters whose grown children with children were returning, all those new expanded families, but not something too new. Work with what we have, they told her. We know how to build these things. She remembered laughing derisively under her breath when the HR rep, reading aloud from the latest sales brochure, described the company's trademark design method. Life design, the rep said to the new recruits. Remember, you're not just designing houses, you're designing lives. Because as the boss says, life design blends the fundamentals of design, architecture, engineering, physics, psychology, and sociology to create a home that looks better and lives better than all the rest. At the time, it sounded completely absurd to her, but now she got it. And now, as her houses grew ever longer and more elaborate, she laughed aloud with uncontrollable glee as she imagined the fantastic new lives that would unfold along their length. As day broke, she stood up and stepped back from the table, exhausted. She surveyed her creations and she was happy. Then it struck her. Her houses needed names. The company always named their plans, and they always used names that, through association, lent prestige to the product. There were the plans named after Italian cities, the Vicenza, the Roma, the Pisa, the Milano, or famous artists or architects, the Picasso, the Renoir, the Van Gogh, the Palladio, or the founding fathers, the Washington, the Hamilton, the Franklin, the Jefferson. The names rarely had anything to do with the actual design, though occasionally a design resembling Mount Vernon might be called the Mount Vernon. She realized that she wanted her houses to have names that were meaningful, names with history, names that spoke to her wild aspirations for the lives of those who would eat and drink and laugh and cry and love and hate in them. Then it came to her. At the meeting later that morning, she presented the fruits of her labors, the Owen, the Fourier, the Buckingham, and the Ledoux. She could tell by the look on her boss's face that she wasn't going to be around much longer. So that's a sad story of an architect venturing too far afield. But one thing with this project as a kind of closing trailer to the book was, whereas Freedomland itself is really a critique, it has ambitions towards identifying other ways, other collective patterns of dwelling and association that we might find. It essentially is a critique of the absolutism of most of our utopian precedents, and of a critique of the total control that architects want to stamp on things most frequently. With this effort working with the same plans, I loosened up the kind of rules. Really, I saw some Richter paintings which were about a kind of constant mirroring, and so I just got in, and without worrying about whether they would be habitable in any conventional sense, wanted to see actually what types of environments they might produce, and then went back in and began to kind of populate them with the furniture to think about, like, what is the form of life? What are the lifestyles that would play out across the length of these absurdly long, weird houses? They don't make any functional sense whatsoever in conventional terms, but I think they produce some really interesting opportunities and some really weird moments. It's not on here, but there's one like double-headed toilet, for a kind of, I guess, particularly intimate kind of conversation. Double grand sort of owner's spa bathtubs, right? That sort of gang up together for, I don't know. There's places in these houses for the kind of monk who wants to isolate. There's also places in these houses for like the hedonists that want to like have orgies all the time. Australia really did not think about controlling life, but just see actually what it would offer. That's the last project I'll talk about from Freedomland, and if you can bear with me for about 6 more minutes, I'd like to read an opinion piece I wrote for the Architects newspaper about 2 years ago now. As I was telling Jason earlier, since taking the job of deanship, I've really been able to do very little of my own work, so this is really a great opportunity to get excited again about some of the things I've been thinking about. And while I read this, On screen, it'll be accompanied by an ongoing project called Useless Plans for Surplus People that I started while I was at the Academy in Rome. The images, plans, pictures, and slogans don't correspond directly to the text, but they do offer a reflection on some of the ideas in the text. The plans, once again, culled and reworked from developer home plans, stage relationships between individuals as a way of thinking about how architecture might direct us toward a reflection upon our mutual interdependence. Think of them as temples of mutual human understanding. The photographs are a collection of shots I took in Rome of churches, but also interiors and the labor, human and machine, that makes leisure possible. And finally, the slogans are variations of signs that I saw in many churches that spoke to me of the need to see each other as partners and caregivers. And Jason thought that it would be a good idea to maybe give you a little background into how I make these plans. It's incredibly easy, which is why I can make so many of them, and why I have a lot of trouble actually discerning like the better from the lesser in them. But I'll walk you through the construction of one of the temples, which are made, as I said, from the same plans used to make Freedomland. So, and maybe I can use this to describe what's going on in the temples too, before I show you how it's made. So essentially, it's turning these builder plans into kind of Palladium axially symmetrical plans, which stage, depending on what results, kind of conditions where you can identify most typically 4 residents, sometimes perhaps 8, sometimes 16, depending on the plan. It multiplies in that way. But you start to think about like how architecture itself, in the way that it structures how we enter something, how we actually find ourselves at a center, how we move towards an edge, positions us in space and necessarily positions us relative to others. So in this one, and I haven't gone through and sort of thought about the actual inhabitation of any of these, and they are totally useless. There's no bathrooms, there's no bedrooms, there's no kitchens, there's nothing that you could not survive in one of these temples. You could not survive in a Greek temple. I guess if you built a fire, you could. So maybe you build a fire in the middle of this, but essentially there's that middle kind of edicula where the 4 could come together, and then there's still the space where they can retreat to their own position, right? And Pier Vittorio writes really beautifully about this, that in order to have a collective, you have to have the space for the individual to be private, right? Collectivity it's necessary to have collectivity to also have privacy. So now so this thing was born of this thing, right? Completely nondescript. This is probably a Pulte home. Pulte is one of my least favorite builders. No, hopefully no one's a Pulte dweller or maker here. So most simply, I would begin, this is all done in Illustrator, with this cone, and identify a position in the plan to situate that cone, and then clip everything out that's not in that cone. Mirror that cone along the diagonal. Mirror that, right? So, and this is like maybe just the total like lover of architecture in me. A lot of the work I'm doing on these plans, like in the back of my mind is like, I'm actually making them architecture, right? So to take that and get that, whoops, oh, now we're in trouble. So now I need to start reading because now these are going to start flying by. Americans define themselves through work. It builds character, or so we believe. The American dream is premised on individual achievement, with the promise that our labor will be rewarded and measured by the things we collect and consume. For many, the sine qua non of the dream, our greatest collectible, is a single-family house. Of all our products, it's the one we most rely on to represent our aspirations and achievements. Throughout the history of our republic, the idea, promoted from the beginning by the likes of Jefferson, heir to Palladio and father of the American suburban ideal, of living in a freestanding house in the middle of one's own personal Eden, has been the dream of generation after generation. So while it was possible for Le Corbusier to say in Paris near the beginning of the last century that a house is a machine for living, from our perspective on this side of the Atlantic and this side of the 20th century, it would be better to append that famous maxim, a house is a machine for living the American dream. At this point in history, this statement seems entirely self-evident, but we still are reminded by our leaders to get our piece of the dream. In promoting his vision of an ownership society in a speech at the St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church in Atlanta in 2002, President George W. Bush said, quote, I do believe in the American dream. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream. And during the early years of the new century, the economy soared as millions of wood-frame dreams sprang up across the country, enabled by an elaborate new financial calculus cooked up on Wall Street. But then the magic formulas which scripted the construction and consumption of ever larger houses in ever-increasing numbers by bundling our dreams together in tradable units began to fail. The dream quickly became a nightmare. As legitimating environmental, and economic, and socio-political narratives that for so long sustained the endless reproduction of suburbia began to collapse, it became clear that the suburban house, rather than manifesting our achievements, masked our delusions. According to the historian John Archer, the romanticized isolation of the individual in a manufactured Arcadian preserve is an increasingly untenable fiction. The myth that we all stand alone, propelled by our own initiative and hard work, is part of that fiction. Suburbs and the detached single-family houses of which they are comprised reinforce it. They work to isolate and separate us, to dislocate us as individuals, detached from any larger heterogeneous collective body. The common cul-de-sac is both literally and symbolically the end of the road, a terminus. Safely sequestered within its 4 or 8 or 16 or 32 walls, we stand apart from the crowd, reaching out through an array of devices to make contact with those who are, more or less, just like us. Space becomes less a medium in which we mix and more a barrier that insulates us from those unlike ourselves. And as houses balloon in size, this sense of disconnection, is amplified within the walls of the house itself, with each inhabitant retreating to ever more far-flung and insular private domestic realms. The social and political consequences of this withdrawal are increasingly obvious in the deterioration of civil society and the erosion of civil discourse. The further we live from each other, the less we are capable of seeing each other as people with shared dreams and struggles, and the more likely we are to see an other, unlike us, who we fear and demonize. The evidence of this was clear in the last election, in which Donald Trump's campaign of intersectional xenophobia claimed the most votes in the United States suburbs, small cities, and rural areas. As our houses spread out, as the distance between us increases, we vote more myopically to protect our own perceived interest and the interest of those we see as like us, at the expense of what is arguably for the greater collective good. But is the detached house with its resulting social detachment a prerequisite of the American dream? Is it possible to imagine other futures for the dream and consequently other futures for dwelling? What would happen if personal happiness were no longer so closely tied to economic success derived from the fruits of one's labor? Those are questions we would be well to consider. Jobs are disappearing. And while presently most of us still need and may even want to sell our labor, it's becoming clearer that with each passing day there will be only fewer buyers. Our relationship to work, and therefore to the American dream, and therefore to our manner of dwelling, and therefore to politics, is changing. According to the network theorist Gert Lovink and the political activist Franco Berardi, the capitalist promise of, quote, full employment turned out to be a dystopia. There is simply not enough work for everyone. Zero work is the tendency, and we should get prepared for it, which is not so bad if social expectations change and we accept the prospect that we'll work less and we'll have more time to think about life, art, education, pleasure, love, and what have you, rather than solely about profit and growth. Our current world is built on a foundation of profit and growth. Our urbanism and the infrastructure and architecture with which it is constructed, including the tens of millions of homes spread thin across the landscape, is the result of a centuries-old economic system. And that system has consistently sought to segregate sites of labor and production from sites of dwelling. The single-family house in a suburban bedroom community along a congested commuter route is the product of a capitalist system in which we head out each day to sell our labor in an indifferent market, returning as night falls to replenish our energies and reclaim our identity. As the market for labor decreases in an increasingly automated world, we need to begin to think about the consequences and benefits of a future without work, or more accurately, with far less wage-earning work. Even now, we can see that a shift is occurring. The recent collapse of the distinction between places of work and living is both a symptom of the underlying economic and technological transformations that are reshaping work as we know it, and a sign that points toward other ways of dwelling. Out of necessity, and in many cases desire, people are beginning to experiment with other ways of living, coming together to form new or new again types of shared live-work households. And as the tendency towards zero work increases, we will need to rethink the way we live. Because if we take the classical definition of work out of the equation, the whole structure of our cities, as well as our manner of living, makes a lot less sense. Already, So now you can look at this, or I can scoot us back a little bit. Hold on. I'll just randomly jump in here. Okay. Already, this probability is leading economist, technologist, and political scientist, but sadly few politicians on either the left or the right, to speculate on the structure of society in the future. A key question is how people will sustain themselves without jobs. There are renewed calls for a universal basic income by tech leaders like Elon Musk, or universal basic dividends suggested by Greek economist and politician Yanis Varoufakis. Bill Gates has even suggested an income tax on robots. In any case, a new economic model, which will necessarily be accompanied by a new political order, in which we are freed from the obligation to sell our labor in order to survive, will require that we consider other conceptions of human productivity, other forms of human association, and of course, other ways of living. In such a future, the American dream, as it's currently defined, would have no utility. But how would we organize our lives in a world where we work less? What would we do? How would we live? In his essay, Fuck Work, the historian James Livingston points towards an answer when he asks, how would human nature change as the aristocratic privilege of leisure becomes the birthright of all? As architects seeking a way forward, we might ask a different version of Livingston's question. How would human habitats change as the privilege of leisure becomes the birthright of all? Liberated from the idea that our dwellings must be understood as freestanding castles, as isolated retreats from society through which we represent our individualism and secure our market share, we could instead conceive of assemblages of dwellings that collectively define a domain of mutual cooperation, interaction, and civil discourse. We have counter-histories of dwelling that offer us guidance in thinking about other possible domestic orders. In 1886, Gaudin, the industrialist I spoke about earlier, wrote that when constructed with a view to unity of purpose and interest, the homes, like the people approach each other, stand solidly together and form a vast pile in which all the resources of the builder's art contribute to best answer the needs of families and individuals. And following this, we might allow ourselves to imagine, as a way of shaking off the dust of the 20th century, living in what the social reformer Robert Owen described as a magnificent palace, containing within itself the advantages of the metropolis, the university, the country residence, without any of their disadvantages. Of course, the American dream can't be transformed overnight. There are aspects of it that are deeply embedded in our collective consciousness. At its core, the dream is about security, comfort, and familiarity, as much as it is about aspiration, accomplishment, and status. Any new ideas about the way we live, if they are to dislodge us from our long habituated connection to the single-family detached house, must be accompanied by new architectural models and delivered through compelling new narratives that situate the needs and desires currently manifest in the house within new patterns that make collective life more desirable. This may seem to be yet another call for a utopia, and therefore criticized as being divorced from the real and pressing concerns of the real world. It's not. For as Lewis Mumford said, the prospects of architecture are not divorced from the prospects of the community. If man is created, as the legends say, in the image of the gods, his buildings are done in the image of his own mind and institutions. The real world is changing rapidly all around us. Meanwhile, we cling to increasingly outmoded dreams. In the future, if we hope not only to survive, but to thrive, we'll need to change our minds and rethink our institutions. We'll have to prioritize community as much as we currently prioritize individuality. We'll have to decide to live together. We'll need new dreams. Thank you.
So much. Hello. It's working.
It's working.
This is an opportunity for questions. Anybody have any questions they wanted to put to Keith at the end?
I promised myself I'd bring it in under an hour, and I think I did if we take Jason's introduction out.
Yeah. I apologize for that. Who wants the mic? Yeah. Mark.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for a very interesting talk. So you're relying on the idea of work disappearing. Is that your own formulation? And what I'm thinking of is just the, throughout the 20th century when all the inventions like washing machines and stuff, they were very much predicting something along that lines would happen, and it really didn't. And we're at totally record low unemployment. So are there certain
Record
people
low
you're getting
unemployment
this
with
from?
a lot of people working multiple jobs to pay their bills. We're also at record high disparity between the highest earners and the lowest earners in our society. So it's not my own idea. Like the end of work is not obviously my own idea. I became really interested maybe now about 3 years ago, and it was Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek politician and economist, that when the EU was like imposing austerity measures on Greece, and there was a really strong reaction there. He was one of the leaders of that, and there was a kind of renewed interest, and Andrew Yang right now with the universal basic income proposal, right, is around how do we develop mechanisms that can rebalance wealth in our society, in Western societies, particularly in the US. And some of that is premised on projections of fewer jobs as AI and robots take on more responsibilities. We're in a moment right now, I think, and I'm not a technologist, and I mean, while I live close to Silicon Valley, I don't talk to those people. I probably should start talking to them. If they would talk to me, I don't know that they'll talk to me. But we're kind of, I think, in a shadow before you will see a great wave of increasing unemployment as machines are doing more and more. You know, we're probably, and I've seen various projections, like trucking is going to be one of the first industries that's really hit, right? They're going to have automated trucks, and slowly it's going to roll through a lot of labor classes, let's say. For a while, it was presumed that professions like architecture and engineering might be immune to these forces. Increasingly, it's sort of seen that we're not off the hook on this either. A lot of the really basic stuff that we do, it would be better done through automation probably. If you think about just calculating like FARs and figuring out how many parking spaces you're going to get, all of that is going to kill jobs. So this is really more taking that as a premise that let me like sort of decreasing work, that let me just think about the house and notions of collectivity that I began thinking about with Freedomland in a new way, that might precipitate a way to think about the house in sort of non-capitalist, 20th century terms, let's say. Right? So, and really to get back to some of those 19th century, there's so many American proposals for model communities that are premised on not like a Soviet collectivism, but on a kind of collectivism and actually on levels of sharing that would be really well to look back to. Ulrich's The Modern Paradise, which is one I did mention tonight, like he writes about gender roles in that are absolutely flat. Its intention was to be a non-patriarchal community, right? Where there would be no like labor distinctions, caregiving distinctions between men and women in that society. So the work thing was really like the next, like almost, I was going to say almost like a MacGuffin in a Hitchcock film. It's really not that, because I do sort of believe that we need to think about it, but it let me sort of spin this work into the next level.
Hi. I was wondering, have you looked at the 1% architecture, like those ridiculously exuberant, wealthy dwellings and kind of spaces, and if wealth redistribution works and the wealth gap is resolved, what will happen to that architecture?
There are some precedents, maybe not the best ones to look at, but if you look at Eastern Europe, those dwellings were chopped up into multiple apartments. So, I mean, that's sort of a basic reuse projection. I don't know, well, I firmly believe that in this country we'll never see a wealth distribution that will result in the taking of all wealth from the wealthiest, right? So what I'm talking about is not that. I think that's kind of a red herring, and we see that in the on the news right now. Republicans, referring to all the Democratic candidates as socialist, right? They're so far from being socialist in any like real sense of the term as we know it in history. I haven't looked at those 1% houses because they're not part of the production culture that I have been looking at, which is the suburban houses and developments. Even within that market, even within individual communities, you can see massive wealth gaps. So I'm not familiar with suburban development in Nebraska, but in the Southeast and in Texas, in any subdivision, you'll have a range of dwellings from like really modest, like 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. Those are typically closest to, let's say, the primary strip. And then as you move deeper into the subdivision, you'll roll through a whole range of class distinctions between dwellings, right? You'll get to the garden cottages, and then you'll get to slightly bigger homes, and you'll end up in the back with like larger houses on larger lots, like getting up to like half-acre lots or 1-acre lots. But that's the stuff I have been looking at and the stuff that I use when I make these drawings. Like I'm not going to be a person that actually designs these new magnificent palaces. It's not the way that I work. It's not actually something that I feel probably best capable of doing. I use this work as a way to reflect upon what we do and to stage kind of new goalpost, right? Like what we might want to move towards. So particularly like the temples that I was just showing, like, you know, those they are truly useless if we think about them in terms of like any of the work stuff I was talking about as dwellings, because they're not set up to be that. It was really trying for me to get back to a point where how does architecture actually operate on a fundamental level to situate each of us individually in relationship to all of us collectively, you know? And so my goal would be, I'm trying to figure out some way that I can build some of those, right, as kind of experiments, like I said, experiments in sort of mutual understanding.
So on the opinion piece, I was just wondering, so when people lose interest to like do a work and then earn for that and then for the comfort and other stuff, and then people become more disenfranchised, I would say, like lose the interest to get a job. And then I was wondering in the future if that happens and no one wants to go to a job and work and they just look for pleasure in other ways and they don't want money, no monetary value, would the political view at that time kind of be like changing the mindset or putting them in prison because the ideologies change? I don't know how that works.
Changing the mindset of incarceration?
Yeah, like when with religion itself, when a country's in a transition, like they go into camps and then they start changing their views. And
Oh, you're talking, would this be premised on like, what do they call those? There's a whole thing now in China where they're,
yes,
right?
yeah. So that's
With
kind of
the
what
ogres.
I'm getting at. Yeah. So I was wondering.
Yes, I believe that we should send people to camp. No. It's a really hard thing. The no work thing or the less work thing or post-capitalism are really hard things to talk about from inside capitalism. Frederick Jameson has this, I'm not going to quote him exactly, but he says like the hardest thing, what is it? Like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Something like that, right? And you can sort of see, like, you know, popular media, like there's so many movies about the world ending, right? Very few about a kind of different, like living in some different order. So I personally don't believe that in order to change society, one needs to actually like have re-education camps. No. I also don't think that all of the work that all of us do, and I think it's important for us to look inside ourselves, like all of the work I do is not work that I take pleasure in doing, right? There's a lot of the part of my job, which is necessary, and I'm happy to do it. But if there were a way in which everyone had a right to fulfill their best purpose as they define it, I think that's something to aspire to. And I don't think that we're so inculcated in a kind of, you know, Calvinist mindset that work is, our value derives from our work, right? Like my value depends upon my work. that it's hard to see something else. But when you think about it, like, really? Like, what if you're like you run the fryer at McDonald's? Or, like, there are a lot of jobs where it would be hard to actually try to define yourself through the thing that you do to keep a roof over your head, or to keep food in your kids' stomachs, or to go to a movie once a week. So I don't have I'm not an economist, so one thing I think I can do as an architect is speculate on different organizations of territory, different positioning of boundaries and apertures and openings that can allow us to think about new relationships with each other, right? And that other partnerships would necessarily have to be involved to think about, like, what are the fundamental economics of post-work? I don't know. I'll never know. I won't have time to read enough to know. But I want to talk to those people who are doing that work. Does that make sense? I mean, you've had jobs, right?
Yes.
Did you love them all?
No.
Did you love any of them?
Yes.
Good. Did the ones that you love have to do with what you're studying now?
No.
No.
No. God, no.
Right.
But yes.
But what, I don't know, raise your hand if you have enough time to read all the things you'd like to read. You could read more. Another thing I like to think of it this way too is like, say you really love to paint, but you're a shitty painter, but you just really love to paint, right? Like if you could, you would just paint all the time. Like you're George Bush, let's say. Right? And this is, I get it, it's like totally utopian, but I like to think of a world where like people who really like to paint but are bad painters could paint. Right? Or people who really love to write but are terrible writers could write. And they could find each other and they could talk about their bad paintings, or or if like you live to play golf but you're a terrible golfer, right? Go play golf. Like I think there's this fear that like people would just sit around being lazy and doing nothing and like be degenerate, and that's like there's such a deep history that has constructed our minds around that notion that I think it's important to work on that, whether the jobs go away or not.
They like to make me run one place to another.
The problem with what I do too is like I do these things that I don't know enough to talk about so much about this. I can talk about the drawings.
Thank you. Okay.
Don't ask me a question about economics.
I know it's not the direction you probably wanted the conversation to go, but it is sort of branching off the last question where you connected the end of work with like the end of consumerism. But I personally, I think that work, even if you are just someone who works at McDonald's, you can find a lot of pride, and like it's a point of social interaction. Maybe if you didn't work, you would not be motivated to paint, no matter how bad you are and no matter how much you love it. There's not much. I feel like some people need the motivation of going to work, even if it's not about the money, even if it is just about getting up, doing something, being in society, and feeling purposeful.
I think I agree entirely with the part of your comment, which is about people wanting to feel that they have a purpose. I think the problem is that we have become so centered around the notion that the job is our purpose, right? That the sort of wage-earning job is our purpose. There are a lot of people who are thinking about post-work in really smart ways, are talking about the fact that in a post-work world, if we define work as it exists now, jobs that are labor that is more about caregiving, right, would have more value, right? The things that in fact machines can't do or can't do well, that we would start to actually, or teaching, right, would be things that would have more value. Things that also, like as a teacher, I can say like the greatest job I've ever had is teaching. Right? It's been the most rewarding. And in some ways, like when I was a professor in a classroom and I taught 5 classes a year, that was like the most rewarding period of my life, right? In my new job now, 2 years in, I'm like, what's made it exciting for me is to recognize that, well, now I'm actually like leading with a group of great teachers, right? So as I begin to define my job as still teaching, it's really amazing. So, but like I think to suggest that you've got to go you got to go dig a ditch in order to feel like painting your painting has some value, I just can't buy into that, right? Does that make sense? So it's just disconnecting purposefulness, like, you know, and human like self-value from wage labor.
It's a lot of value on people's, you're assuming a lot of people have hobbies they desperately want to pursue.
But it's even like, why would it be? It's no longer a hobby. Well, I would also assume that that we have a better education system, that people actually are exposed to and provided with resources to try things out, right? Like, I don't know, like I have a 10-year-old son now. His arts education in his school district, which is ostensibly a great school district, is terrible. You know, like he's not even getting exposure at school, which I would think would be one place to have it. He gets it at home, probably not enough, to different ways of being in the world and different things that you can do as a human being in the world. So the purposefulness, yes, like, you know, you would need to work towards a system, I think a political and economic system that provided people with the resources to actually find their purpose, right? Not to demand that their purpose be reproducing the machine.
One last question. Cool.
Let me off the hook. I'm not smart enough for this.
I want to, David Newton, thank you very much. We're supposed to be.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Very, very interesting. And I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, you looked at a lot of pattern books and probably just immersed yourself in the thinking of, you know, the creation of domestic space for over a span of hundreds of years. And I'm just curious, I'm thinking of Robin Evans' essay, Figures, Doors, and Passages, and how wonderful that essay is in terms of talking about the relationship between a model of the relationship between the house and society and cultural ideals. And so I wonder, were there any kind of patterns you began to, maybe large patterns or kind of interesting evolutions you began to see that maybe you didn't notice before through all that kind of research?
What was maybe most surprising to me was like the patterns moving backward. I don't think there's I didn't identify any significant moments of change, let's say, in the development of the American suburban house. I mean, you know, they're clear, like it gets bigger, there are more models, right? You start to have more variation. So I guess that's a significant change. As production methods change, as wealth grows, as policies change to support, right? So like all the things we know about, like mortgage practices and all the things and fuel subsidies, all the things that make suburbia possible. What was most interesting to me was looking back, and I showed some of this in the pattern books, is that like a rendering that Toll Brothers does right now is really not at all different from like an Edmund Bartel, you know, rendering in his pattern book from 1804, right? One big change was when nature started to be drawn in with the architecture. So, you know, Palladio, Serlio, all of those exist essentially like as decontextualized. They sit on a white page, the plans, the drawings. All of a sudden they start to be situated as the kind of Arcadian ideal becomes deeply attached to the house. I didn't, you know, like I know the Evans essay, it's an amazing essay. I tried to stick to like primary sources with this, so I wasn't looking at interpretations. It's not entirely true. I was reading some Mumford because I wanted to get like a picture of what the perspective on suburbia was early in the 20th century, but really looking directly to the pattern books and to the builder catalog. So I spent a lot of time, so the life design thing in that last short story about the young architect designing those long houses, that's like directly from David Weekley, who's the home center that Jason described, visiting together. That's their language. So I was reading the literature of the builders, all of that. And what was interesting is how significant, I guess one thing that was really important to notice too is that all of these builders talk about architecture, right? And they use architecture. In their sales literature, they talk about architecture, and they use architecture as a way of elevating the status of the product. Meanwhile, all of us, like what is it? Look at those shitty houses, or sort of dismiss it. I mean, that was the great bond that Jason and I formed, was because we were like, why isn't anyone looking at these things? They're really interesting and strange and kind of wonderful. I mean, I will confess also to having a certain level of Stockholm syndrome stuff. It's there's a lot of things that some of these builders are doing that I deeply admire in a devious, like it's devious, but it's right. Yeah. Imagine if all the if dentistry was like only 5% of dentistry was done by dentists. Terrible. Well, I almost fell off the stage. I mean, there is a piece in the discourse of Freedomland where I talk about, architects haven't proven themselves unwilling or incapable of designing homes with appeal, something like that. Yeah, I mean, that is a part of it, was to, I mean, the reason it's done this way as opposed to like Jason's amazing book, Manifest Destiny, right? Manifest Destiny. Which looks at all these kind of, looks at suburbia and looking at specific moments and these sort of odd, right? Like, I don't know how you would describe them, but these kind of, is there a single term you would use to?
Well, I would describe it as an oblique look at the ordinary.
But it's almost like a dictionary of suburban, right? But a pattern book of parts, right? There's no whole houses in there. Whereas this, like I really wanted to say, what would an architect do with this stuff as a way of both looking at the problems of what architects do, but also the nature of the stuff itself, if that makes sense, right? I mean, I don't, we're never going to have more than 5. I think 5% is high, probably, as an estimate. It's probably 2%. Thanks, everyone, for coming and sticking it out.
Thank you.